Welcome to Hype Hazard, your source for exposing the tech behind the hype. Today's technology landscape is bringing head-spinning innovation to every industry, but it is also chock full of a whole lot of risky business.
And in our show, we'll cut through the flash and ease all of your FOMO, helping you navigate the hazardous data conditions ahead and see past all of those mesmerizing marketing ploys in order to uncover the real opportunities.
So, be you a citizen adopter, a prudent practitioner, or a discerning executive, this podcast is for you. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, may we introduce ourselves? I'm Jessica Grootman.
And I'm Jamie Szymanski. We are technology analysts and founders of Kaleido Insights, a research firm. We have spent our careers researching countless disruptive technologies and how they impact consumers, businesses, and society.
Now, we've seen more technological junk along the way than we'd like to even count, but we've also seen some truly transformational gems. And so in Hype Hazard, we'll share our experience with you, yes, you, to help you contextualize the most hyped up technologies for what they really actually are.
And spoiler alert, rubbish abounds in Techland. And with that, let's dive in. Today, we'll be talking about Rivian and the burgeoning electric vehicle market. Now, electric vehicles, in and of themselves, I wouldn't say they're necessarily new. So you might be asking yourself, why are we focused on Rivian? Well, we think Rivian has a couple of pretty unique positioning elements for an electric car startup that have piqued our interest. Some in the vehicle features itself and the positioning and branding, and others really lie in the company's mission and vision. So first, let's focus on vehicle features and positioning. They tout themselves as the first electric vehicle maker to produce what they call electric adventure vehicles.
Electric adventure vehicle.
And what they mean by adventure vehicles, they're basically talking about a truck and an SUV. And they are all electric, so they're battery powered only. And the difference here in terms of battery powered versus other type of electric vehicles, battery electrical vehicles, they store and deliver energy through the battery alone to the powertrain of the car. Whereas you may have heard of fuel cell electric vehicles where they generate electricity using hydrogen as fuel, but then they also deliver energy to the powertrain. So Rivian's vehicles are all electric. They have the SUV and the truck. They start at around $70,000.
A smooth 70K.
Oh boy, talk more about that later. And they'll be available in 2021 to consumers. I think it's also important to note that they have a pretty sweet deal with Amazon right now where they are providing 100,000 delivery vans. They've been ordered with the company, and those will also start coming out in 2021. They boast up to 400 miles in electric range. If you have an electric vehicle or a fuel cell vehicle out there and you're listening, you know how tremendous 400 plus miles is in electric range.
Yeah, this is a huge differentiation.
Big time. And I mean, you do have to pay on top of the 70,000 just for a special battery to get to the 400 plus miles. But it's really critical, I would say, to positioning itself as an adventure vehicle, electric vehicle company. It's a previously untapped market, I think. I mean, save for the Tesla apocalyptic looking Cybertruck, I haven't seen a lot of people market their companies as adventure vehicles, although now we are seeing some of these auto incumbents come to the scene as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit in the hype.
Yeah.
A couple other things about the technology. Of course, they offer the normal smart car experience that many of us are accustomed to. So this includes these over-the-air updates of vehicle software to enhance functionality, improve performance, collecting data, always collecting data. This contributes to their insurance that they offer as well, which is underwritten by Nationwide. So they are able to see the data of the car as you're driving it or the sport utility vehicle or truck and be able to predict repairs before they need to happen, as well as see how you're driving and use that to impact your premiums. Beyond that, they do have some self-driving capabilities. They're hardware-enabled level 3. If you're familiar with a few different levels of self-driving cars, that means hands-off wheel and eyes-off road. And as of January 2021, they have raised a total of $8 billion since the start of 2019, including investment from Ford, which I find quite interesting. But beyond that, which gets us, I would say, primed for the hype, Jess, would be their main differentiator, doing their part to what they say transition the world to sustainable energy. They have a goal of achieving carbon neutrality across their entire business no later than 2028, which is quite the goal, Jess.
That is quite the goal. And the segue you mentioned, I think, of the fundraising is an important one to get into the hype. Let's just pause and kind of think for 1 second about how much money $8.2 billion is in funding over 9 rounds. Now, this is a company that, yes, there are cars out there, but they have not yet come to market. This is one of the reasons that we're talking about them. 2021 is their coming to market year. Its post-money valuation is over $10 billion, and that's as of January 2021. That's wild.
To call itself a startup, I keep reading things about Rivian and I'm like, startup, I put it in quotes at that point with that amount of funding.
Indeed. And this company has actually been around for 12 years. So that which we call a startup by any other name. So why now? Why the hype? As we mentioned, they are bringing not one, not two, but 3 different cars to market this year. Although a little bit of delay in actually being able to get them. If you order one today, you actually won't get one until next year. But another reason for the hype is sort of a lesson in contrasts. We all know of Tesla, but Tesla doesn't actually do any advertising. There's Elon Musk. It's a very big personality of a founder, but Tesla itself is not really out there on car commercials, on, billboards. And so this is an opportunity for Rivian because they're most often compared to Tesla as a sort of brand new greenfield startup, type of electric vehicle. They're also, as you mentioned, really focused on a different part of the car market, on trucks, on SUVs, particularly with their contract with Amazon. This is vans. This is the commercial side. So they run up against some of the big incumbents like Ford and GM, but they're often compared in kind of mainstream depictions with Tesla. So I think they're leaning into this comparison. And in some ways, there is a second mover advantage here of being the non-Tesla. They have a lot of room to have a lot of the sort of new brand novelty and fresh affinity, and especially when we talk about some of the connected car service models that come into play with that. And they are doing quite a lot of advertising. I mean, one thing that's really interesting is we've watched in the last year little droplets around incredible features around their charging stations. You mentioned their factory, their solar power charging canopy, so that when a car comes off the factory line, it will be solar charged immediately so that you can drive it off the lot, or it drives itself off the lot. They're offering their own vehicle insurance. They are hiring 1,500 positions all around North America.
150 people a week they're hiring, which is fantastic. I mean, and on top of that, to your point of, well, hopefully getting some cars off the line soon and they don't turn into a Faraday Future or a Fisker situation. But they have one of their biggest manufacturing plants is actually in Normal, Illinois, which is sort of bringing a lot of manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest, which is also, I think, played really well in their hype in the press.
Absolutely. And speaking of press, another one of these little droplets was Jeff Bezos driving one of the first SUVs or trucks in part of the commercial. And this Amazon contract is a crucial part of the story here. This contract was for 100,000 electric vehicles, as you said. This was a $700 million investment from Amazon. So this is not a nothing investment. This is not just a press release. There are already, in San Francisco, for example, there are already these Rivians actually on the road making deliveries today. And so this is a big play as a commercial electric vehicle, not just on the consumer retail side. They just announced as one of these kind of bite-sized droplets that they will be delivering a 175,000 mile warranty for the battery pack, for the drivetrain, and the whole concept that we should explain to people is around OTA upgrades, over-the-air upgrades.
Right.
And this is a huge topic in and of itself, but this is part of that warranty that they will continue to deliver over the air, over software updates, new features, fixes to bugs, new rollouts. And when you listen to these companies talk about their future, they are talking about radically different business models where you may actually own the shell or the hardware of the car, and you even have physical upgrades to the innards of the car. But the car improves and becomes more personalized, new features, as I mentioned, over time. So again, this is a radically different way of thinking about the valuation of the car and therefore the business models for automotive.
Well, and the valuation of a Rivian continues long after, which sort of overlaps with this messaging they have around sustainability and sustainable energy and carbon neutrality. They've also really been heavy on the marketing about their battery packs in and of themselves, that they're designed to be really easily removed from a Rivian vehicle after the life of the vehicle has passed, so that the batteries can be recycled and used in sort of second life applications like, stationary storage or powering part of your house or some of your outdoor lighting. So I think that that's really interesting to see that they're thinking not only about the life of the vehicle as being something that is also contributing to sustainability for the planet, but after the vehicle's life is over, you are able as the user to take out the battery and reuse it, which I think is really important to a lot of consumers today. And it's what we've been examining for, I would say, the last few years now, Jess, at Kaleido Insights, is this sort of overarching trend of consumers caring more about purpose-driven companies and caring more about sustainability. And so for Rivian to come into the market and say they're producing trucks and SUVs that are meant for adventure, that are typically full of gas guzzlers in the market, with the bigger the better the engine and really little care for environmental impacts, they're speaking to a new base of consumers. I just read a study from IBM that came out, I think, last June or July in 2020, saying that basically sustainability has really reached a tipping point for consumers. The study showed that 57%, so more than half of all consumers surveyed, are willing to change their shopping habits to reduce environmental impact, and 8 in 10 respondents indicated sustainability is important for them. And they also did a breakdown in terms of what drives consumers, and there's still about half and half. Half consumers are driven by value, so getting a good deal and good prices, whereas the other half, though, are these purpose-driven consumers, Jess.
Right,
and so they want to work for brands and buy products from companies that are willing to sort of walk the walk when it comes to sustainability, and not just give this, corporate social responsibility PR speech, but actually put their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. Now, there's some other kind of big picture, I think, market context to not just Rivian, but also the electric vehicle market now, and why it is simultaneously hyped, but also we have to be aware of some of the hazards or maybe some of the false promises that could lie within that. And so, I mean, you mentioned the big trend around purpose-driven brands and marketing. Part of that, too, is that we're not just talking about automotive when we talk about the future of mobility. We're talking about cities. We're talking about tourism and hospitality, shared economy. Look at Uber, for example, logistics, transportation. There are several different industries that are kind of vying for this market share, for owning these different pieces. And that brings in kind of several other trends. I mean, you mentioned consumer preferences, but also access versus ownership. This is one of the big questions that, as I mentioned, this disrupts business models of OEMs. This is one of the big questions they're facing. How do we make money if we aren't selling cars, but if we're actually just selling access? And do we sell it per day, per mile, etc.? There are other trends, obviously, around sustainability and the need for electrification. And also, I mean, one of the fascinating things about the car space is that it's not just the electrification, EV sustainability conservation trend, but it's also the digitalization. It is the computerization, the entire autonomy of a car. And both of these kind of mega trends are colliding in some of these brand new, I mean, in all automotive companies right now, but especially in these newer ones that don't have the long legacies and big kind of incumbent infrastructure that a Ford or a GM or whoever has. These new companies are now building from scratch these designs that are simultaneously electrified, but are also digitized, and trying to figure out what is the right business model. How much do we bring in-house, centralized, versus do we rely on partners in a more decentralized or dispersed fashion? How does this relate to circular economics, right? You mentioned the kind of the life of the battery and how that could actually offer another form of value to customers over time. So there's several trends that are colliding here, but how much of it will come to pass in the near term and as part of the brand story remains to be seen.
Well, right. And how much of it is Rivian actually responsible for, or is going to add to their roadmap versus not? I mean, sure, they're offering, the service where you can recycle their battery to contribute to a more circular economy, as you mentioned. However, if you think about some of these other more emerging business models that comes to sharing versus buying vehicles, let's say, it feels like they're pretty tone deaf to that. I mean, even just in general, they're offering their cars to start at $70,000.
That's so accessible and inclusive.
Right, exactly. So you can tell already that they are marketing themselves more toward lifestyle and luxury, which to
Right.
me flies in the face of a
Right.
lot of these models of sustainability. And I think that gets into a little bit of a hazard too in the bigger picture of the electrical vehicle market and some of the subsidies that, consumers are given to purchase these vehicles and who these subsidies actually benefit and who they don't. I mean, if you're going to give a 5,000 or 2,000 depending on your state or federal subsidy for buying an electrical vehicle, if that's what you are rewarded for contributing to, the betterment of the environment and the planet, but then the cars themselves cost $70,000 or more in some cases. Who is actually benefiting from these breaks when everyone's taxes are what contribute to providing the breaks in the first place?
Right.
You look at who's owning electric vehicle buyers, and surveys have shown that at least, was it 56% of them have an income of at least $100,000 a year, and 17%, Jess, over 200,000. So
Wow.
it's kind of fair to say that these subsidies pretty disproportionately benefit the wealthy then at the expense of the poor who are paying taxes for the subsidies, as well as, if you look at some communities where electricity is still largely powered by non-renewable energy sources, you can see how those rates would then also rise. Electricity rates rise in the city. And it's this big, ugly picture that often I feel is behind the surface that we haven't quite solved for yet in the electric vehicle market.
It's such an interesting point because it offers, both of these things can be true. In other words, you just mentioned the reality of these subsidies and who they actually impact and who they actually kind of extract from. Meanwhile, if you have seen anything from Rivian, you have seen their map. It reminds me of the T-Mobile map. This is a map of the United States that shows dots all over the United States. And these dots may or may not be real at this point, but the story that they're telling is that we are trying to focus on what they call electron deserts. Okay. So the rural areas in the deep south and Hawaii and Alaska, trailheads, motels in the middle of nowhere, campgrounds, rural areas to build EV charging infrastructure. And the story there is obvious. The story is one of accessibility. The story is getting EV market share outside of San Francisco, New York, and LA.
Sure, but do you think these rural areas, do you think that the median income is often going to support a $70,000 vehicle? So again, there's a disconnect there in their story, right?
Exactly. It's so true. And not just Rivian, but any EV manufacturer or hybrid or whatever faces this sort of chicken and egg, this huge market tension in the EV space right now, which is that it's really difficult to make money on charging without selling EVs. But in order to sell EVs, you need charging stations.
Right,
So
right.
profits won't appear unless you have that network, but you need the traffic to sustain the network. And so, again, how much to rely on existing infrastructure, how much to build your infrastructure. By the way, listeners should know that not all EV charging stations are created the same. They support specific manufacturers, specific cell types. So this is part of the tension that, they're clearly strategically thinking about to disperse access of these networks. But how truly available is that to seed the market, especially with such a high price point? Both of these things are true, but they are on their face quite contradictory.
Absolutely. And I think we've talked a lot now about some of the interesting business model impacts and environmental impacts, but I want to talk somewhat too in the hazards section here about the data piece of this. So we talked a little bit about over-the-air updates, but I think that Rivian, it's something that they've really marketed as a benefit to their drivers, is that using telematics that they can inform when the car needs to be repaired, they can do predictive maintenance, but I'm more concerned with how it will be used for their usage-based insurance, or UBI. And as I mentioned, that's being underwritten right now by Nationwide Insurance. And what I'm most concerned with is the ability for users to still protect their data privacy, to understand what data is being collected about them and their vehicle and their habits, how that data is being used, how it's being sold, and then more importantly, perhaps, how that data is being used, often in accompaniment with AI, to actually make decisions. So we do a lot of research here at Kaleido Insights, listeners, on data stewardship and what it means for a company to be a good steward of data. And I think that Rivian is ripe to be a company that could emerge at the forefront of showcasing how they protect consumers and almost issuing, a consumer bill of rights of sorts about data stewardship as it applies to AI and as it applies for their drivers and the ability for them to opt out of using such AI for usage-based insurance throughout, the life cycle of being a driver.
This is such a crucial point. I mean, we can't underestimate how different this is from what we think about of a traditional driving experience. Yes, cars today collect data. This is true. But what we're talking about when we talk about these business models based on over-the-air updates, these business models based on individuals driving what's called in the industry active driving assistance safety technology, ADAS, and that is actually used as a way to reduce insurance costs and earn rewards and build loyalty.
It's always the positive angle they tout, not the fact that they were spying on every single driving move you make. But
Exactly. But we don't think about every single, and I don't just mean speed. I mean, how you hover, where you drive, the routes that you take, literally every aspect. I mean, these devices, when we have to call them devices, because what we're building here is computers on wheels, these devices are big data engines every second of the day. This question of how much data is being collected and how is that data being used. Some of it has very individual implications, but some of it is crucial for training the car. This is how autonomous vehicles, this is how computer vision works. This is how AI generally works. It needs a lot of data to learn and to train.
Right. But that training data is often anonymized in a certain way so that it is not traceable back to an individual, which I think a lot of people would be willing, to share their data in that sense. I mean, studies have shown that really about half of drivers are all comfortable with sharing their data with their car company or insurer. So I think that maybe the tides are changing. They're fine with sharing their data, but again, it's about the use. And I think we have to think at the bigger picture here too, not only as it relates to privacy and security of your data as collected for the vehicle like Rivian, but also what about the data ecosystem? So as you mentioned, a car is simply this large computer on wheels as it's starting to become. And what happens then when that smart vehicle can connect to other IoT devices and what data profile does that really create for an individual? And does your behavior in terms of how you drive, which you thought was really only being used for car service and maintenance and car insurance, well, hey, now that data is being combined with your GPS data and where you're driving and maybe how often you're home and how often you're not. And it develops a much more ingrained risk profile that now also impacts things like life insurance rates, or maybe it impacts things in the future like your credit score based on what devices you're using when and what data they're sharing with others. And I think this could get really into a sort of, Black Mirror type situation where people don't realize how their data is contributing to this greater picture of who they are and not only their risk score, but oftentimes their worthiness in different capacities, which is pretty frightening.
The quote, as is often summarized here, and this is actually used in marketing materials, is, "We'll know you have an issue before you know you have an issue." In the context of remote care, right, and predictive maintenance, it's sort of always watching.
Yeah, take that wide.
I mean, one thing to your point is to remember who's looming in the background. We mentioned that there are 9 huge investors here, but one of those, or multiples of those, but certainly the biggest one in terms of our digital footprints looming over on the sideshow here is Amazon. So we talk about the ways in which this data can be used and sold or shared or developed into many different tributaries of different services that may or may not seemingly have anything to do with driving. There is a company like Amazon, who obviously is one of the largest companies and digital stewards in the world.
That's a great point. And I think that probably is just an excellent transition too, in terms of, well, what needs to change here? And I think first and foremost, I mean, I was joking with a listener last week that I think the hype hazard should probably have a section that's just dedicated to data privacy and data stewardship, because it is a resounding theme. And Rivian is no different, especially with some of the different backers they have and investors, as you said, Amazon included. I think that something that needs to change is they need to be very transparent in terms of their current and future plans for data usage and how specifically it's being used to impact not only service of the vehicle and insurance, but any other way that they might be sharing it with Amazon, and how you could combine that data, let's say, with other purchases you're making through the provider. I think that's one definite way we could see this space evolving for good. Definitely. Away from some of the hazards. I also love to see, I don't know about you, but I love to see that all of this competition is sort of spurring some of the these incumbent traditional
Yep.
automakers to step up to the plate and to the challenge of electric vehicle manufacturing. I mean, Rivian's trucks and SUVs, based on price point alone, but also the fact that they're all electric and not fuel cell, they're made for a very specific sort of quote unquote adventurer compared to some of these workhorse trucks that are typically made by Ford and Chevy and other incumbent automakers. So it's just wonderful to see that, Ford has an electric truck that they just launched. I think we all saw Biden peel out at 90 miles an hour when he was trying it out. But that one comes in, I think it's like $35K. So, it's half the price. And so it's really opening up the electric vehicle market to more people.
Yeah, the cost piece is just crucial here. And one of the interesting things about automotive, and Tesla took the same strategy of essentially leveraging the rich to bring the price down and making the gamble that this is going to be a 2, 3, 4, 5, 10-year process. And I think this is, ultimately what Rivian is trying to do. We talked about the sort of tensions of both things being true, this being sort of exclusionary today, but the story that they're telling is more inclusionary over time. The thing is, they don't actually fully control all of the levers here. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, but which is incredibly relevant to Rivian's future, is this chip shortage, this global chip shortage, and this is relevant to all automotive companies. So how can they make this story viable of what is crucial to build out that network, the chicken and the egg problem? But, how will they ensure supply chain of lithium batteries is another one. How will this company tap into that ecosystem? Their strategy right now, clearly, very much, is to build their own. They want to own the customer relationship. They want to own the hardware. They want to own...
But that's not sustainable. You and I both know that. It has to be an ecosystem approach and for any innovation to be sustainable, and in their case, to be affordable. I'm really glad you brought that up as sort of a last point here about Tesla, and that, it would be easy right now in a broad sweep to say, I think that Congress should immediately, eliminate all of these electric vehicle tax credits and subsidies that just benefit the wealthy, as I was talking about earlier. But in reality, a lot of times those tax credits are also what are harnessed by companies like Tesla in order to do all the things they need over time and innovate on their own in order to bring that price down eventually and make the technology cheaper. So I think it's not a clear-cut solution, but I would agree that I don't believe that they should continue to operate in a vacuum and that they need to look at other elements of their supply chain and consider other partnerships and not be so obsessed with owning the entire journey, because that really won't work out for them in the long run. When with that, Jess, I think it is probably time for us to talk ratings. Now, dear listeners, at this point in the show, we always rate the technology du jour on a highly scientific scale. We either rate it trash, garbage abound in Techland, so buyer beware of the rubbish in disguise, or we rate it a flash. These are flash in the pan, so they are very hot right now, but they're fleeting once they exhaust early adopters. Or do we rate it a cash? This is a moneymaker with scalable potential, but ultimately nothing super innovative. And then a splash. This is a technology that is fundamentally innovative, and it's just really full of this transformative potential that we examine if it actually can fix a real problem. So, Jess, what do you rate Rivian?
Oh, Jamie, I went back and forth on this one, but our system is quite scientific. And if we're sticking with the science here, I'm going to rate it on the basis of today, not on the basis of future storytelling. Yes. And because of that, I'm rating this a cash. A moneymaker today, but ultimately kind of a copycat down the road. Now, the reason that I say this is that this is a fascinating company. Obviously, what they bring here is around the technology. Their investor portfolio is crucial. That's a lot of the cash and the valuation. The future business model is not unique to them, but is a very potentially lucrative business model if it can get over some of these kind of chicken and egg market tensions. But this company is a little bit behind the market, certainly in terms of the technology. Maybe not in terms of the infrastructure. When it comes to the experience of the car, of the driver, we don't know yet. So we can't say whether this is a splash or anything else. We'll see. That said, we talked about how crucial an open ecosystem is. And this current strategy that they're working on now of very much build internally, very much a closed ecosystem, it makes sense because it is less risk averse. It is more direct to consumer. But that is not the trajectory of something like electric vehicles. It has to be an open ecosystem. Now, we'll see if Amazon or Cox Automotive or some of their big investors kind of shift that narrative. But for today, going on the data that we have about this company, I'm going to rate it a cash.
I think that's smart, Jess. I think it's smart because I also rated it a cash.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. So I rated it cash for a lot of the same reasons you did. I think that they have a great brand story, which is too often the case in new technologies that we explore on Hype Hazard. I think they're tackling smartly a new market to say they're targeting adventurers and they're, really getting into the trucks and SUVs, which again, that is a money maker more than anything else. I think that they have the opportunity to scale, which according to our scientific ratings, we say cash has something that has a scalable potential. Again, with what you said, that I think that if they open up to the ecosystem, they can scale. But ultimately, yes, they offer the 400-mile, charge for batteries, and they have a 175,000-mile warranty and all the features. However, it's really not anything super innovative. It's not like they have a new battery technology. They're not operating any differently. They use that same sort of, we didn't really talk about this, but the sort of skateboard, which is when everything sort of lives underneath the bed of the vehicle. And a lot of other vehicles already use that. So I think that they have a lot of opportunity to make a lot of money at that price point as well. But I can't rate it a splash and say it's fundamentally innovative or even full of transformative potential, because I have to see some of these vehicles come off of the lot, and I have to see if they offer any sort of data to show that they are getting toward carbon neutral or any of the other messaging points that they have. Well, that's it today for Hype Hazard. Thank you, listeners, for joining us, and join us the next time, please, where we will continue to expose the tech behind the hype. And in the meantime, feel free to check out all of our content on new and emerging technology impacts at kaleidoinsights.com. We'd also like to thank Randy Ward for our sound editing and Adam Roskowitz, who composed our music and sound effects. Until next time, cheers.
Bye-bye.